Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Flores, and I'm the Field Application Scientist Manager Europe at Unchained Labs. I'll be your moderator today, and thank you for joining us. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. To ask questions, please click on Q&A button in the Zoom navigation bar at your screen and type your question. When submitting a question, please avoid clicking the anonymous button so we can reach out via email if we have no time to get to your question. And now I would like to introduce Del Jackson, Marketing Manager of Buffer Exchange and Workflows at Unchained Labs. Today, Del will talk about our latest buffer exchange system called Unagi. Unagi is the first completely hands-free benchtop buffer exchange platform. Unagi brings together all the critical and painful steps it takes to exchange buffers or concentrator samples. And now I'll hand it over to Del. Hello, Del. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Appreciate the nice introduction. And hi, everyone. I am Del, and happy here to talk to you today about biting into hands-free on-the-money buffer exchange with Unagi and Big Tuna. So when you hear those two product names, you can't help but think of sushi. It's very popular in the town that I live in to get the option of all-you-can-eat sushi, which sometimes I will definitely enjoy, especially if it's at the end of a week and I'm out with a bunch of friends. But there are other times where I just want a little bit, and so I'll still order it a la carte. But it's really nice to have that choice between the two to fill my appetite. And speaking of different appetites, if you're tuning in, then you no doubt have different appetite for buffer exchange. Buffer exchange is very essential for, all across drug discovery or screening or formulation development if you're working with biologics and gene therapy. And just a quick examples of why it's so important. If you're working with vectors like lipid nanoparticles that are created in ethanol, you want to remove that ethanol as quickly as you can to avoid any further size changes. With viral vectors such as AAVs, often you can manufacture them in large quantity, but they can be quite dilute. And so you might need to concentrate them down and perhaps also do some buffer exchange on top of it. Working with nucleic acids, it's critical to desalt them many times so you can get accurate downstream analysis done. And if you're working with proteins and antibodies, it's often a critical step to find the perfect formulation that they want to exist in, and that's where buffer exchange becomes very critical for that. And if you're like most of us in the industry, you may still be using manual methods to do that. And there are pros and cons to them. With dialysis and centrifugation, very accessible, but there are drawbacks for sure too. With dialysis, you have the risk of diluting out your sample. With centrifugation, you have a lot to get done in a day, and having to spend a lot of hands-on time babysitting your samples in a centrifuge can be a challenge. And sometimes you can also have low sample recovery because of membrane clogging. And with TFF, can be complicated to set up, and typically, if you're farther downstream working almost in the manufacturing phase, then it's more of a good fit because you might have larger samples. But regardless of how you're doing this, sample prep is definitely a time sink, especially if you're using manual methods. You need to oftentimes buffer exchange, and then if you're doing dialysis, for example, you have to do concentration in a separate step. And if you over or undershoot that, then you kind of have the cyclic process where you might have to go back and forth to hit your perfect concentration point. And if you're doing formulation, forget about it. Can you imagine having to set up all of these different dialysis bags or cartridges? It'd be just a lot of work. And so it's critical. What you really need, though, is to go through many conditions, screen lots of conditions, so you can understand what those downstream final manufacturing settings might be. So what is the alternative? Well, as the title suggests, as Sandra gave a clue to, it is our buffer exchange solution, which comes in the choice of between two different formats. One is Unagi and one is Big Tuna. But before we go into the details on them, how they differ a little bit, I want to start with what makes them the same. And it really boils down to this: our automated pressure-based ultrafiltration diafiltration, that's the UFDF technology. If you're familiar with the principle of spin columns, it's similar, but instead of using centrifugation as force, we actually use a pressure chamber, which you'll see in a moment, to apply even positive pressure over all your samples. But that's not the coolest part of our technology that exists on Unagi and Big Tuna. It's definitely the fact that we can get individual sample volume measurements. Why does that matter? Well, we take the volume measurement at first, and then throughout the entire buffer exchange or concentration cycles. And why that's so cool is because we get a sample by sample measurement of the flow rate, and we can adapt the amount of time we apply positive pressure to your samples to, in essence, the fastest flowing one. And what does that give you? Well, it gives you, it actually prevents the possibility of drying out or losing any of your samples because they might flow at different rates. What it also gives you is really like targeted, precise results, because Big Tuna and Unagi know exactly how much new buffer to add back in at the end of every buffer exchange cycle, and then at the end, exactly how much your samples have been concentrated to. Another cool part of our technology is that we have gentle orbital mixing. This matters because, as I alluded to earlier, with other techniques that you can suck away your sample recovery, usually through this phenomenon referred to as dead-end ultrafiltration. With Unagi and Big Tuna, you keep your biomolecules of interest in solution longer with gentle orbital mixing, and that gives you really two things. One is higher sample recovery, and second is actually faster results because we're not clogging up that membrane as we do buffer exchange and concentration cycles. Speaking of concentration, you have something nice on Unagi, a reduced sample volume application. So again, if you're working with something like AAVs that are quite dilute, and you want to concentrate them down, you can actually take, for all 8 samples, take them down from 48 mils all the way down eventually to half a mil. And Big Tuna does the same thing as well, from 48 mils also down to 500 microliters for 24 samples at once. And both systems are really designed so that everybody in your lab can take advantage of them. And one of the key ways that we do that is by giving you presets based upon the experiment type. So whether it's a buffer exchange or perhaps buffer exchange and concentration, your biomolecule, and then the concentration value as well. And what that gives you is 32 presets, so you can very quickly set up your runs. But if you need to maybe tweak them a little bit more, maybe you have special conditions or whatnot, all of the settings that run Unagi and Big Tuna are customizable. And what are some of those settings? Well, in addition to the ones that you just saw about like pressure, there's also percent removal. So you can actually control in a cycle how much volume is going to be taken out of your samples. That can be very helpful if you're working with something that might crash out at a critical concentration level. So you can actually increase the percent removal, so only a little bit's taken out. Percent exchange, this is the key one if you're doing buffer exchange. Maybe there are cases where you just need like a 92% buffer exchange. You just want to quickly, clean up your samples. You can program that, or you can go all the way up to 99.9% if you really need to, clean up and exchange your samples. And then of course your final concentration values is something you can program. So I had said everybody in the lab can do it. Besides the presets, the other way that we do that is by making sure that our software is accessible so everybody in the lab can use it. You're not programming really automation in this case, you're really programming buffer exchange and concentration. And so we want to make sure that it's straightforward enough so that everybody can take advantage of this equipment for you. And even on Big Tuna, as you'll see in a moment, which uses plates, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be harder. So we have a nice graphical import feature, or graphical setup feature rather, for Big Tuna. So you can set up your plate maps in the unfilters and also import your sample and buffer information. And both platforms are going to give you constant readout on what's happening. So you can set up your runs and then take off, but if you ever need to come back in and check in on them, you can see the status not only of the entire experiment, where it's at, but also you get a sample by sample breakdown, which is really cool. The other reason it's cool, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's such a cool feature, I got to take a moment, is the fact that you can pause your runs on Unagi and Big Tuna and remove any samples that might be done. Why do you want to do that? Well, maybe you just want to send those samples downstream. Maybe you want to put them in the fridge, or overall, it will make your runs go quicker because that adaptive process that I spoke about earlier will now adapt to the samples that are left over, and in the end, you will get quicker runs. It's not a requirement, but a nice feature that a lot of customers have appreciated. Finally, it is 2022. There's no reason that something like buffer exchange, which is essential, right, which is critical to so many different applications and workflows, that you can't get full data out of it. So on both on both Unagi and Big Tuna, you're able to get a sample by sample breakdown. You get experiment logs, summary reports, and raw reports. These can be exportable. They can be saved to a network drive, but really, it's nice because now you can have that data feedback, data record capture on your buffer exchange for all of your samples. So now the fun part, which one is better suited for you? Which one will you choose? Well, let's start with the Big Tuna, which is all about high throughput. With that platform, you'll be able to do up to 96 exchanges or concentrations in parallel. The working volume range is actually the smaller of the two, as we'll see. It starts from 100 microliters and goes all the way up to 48 mils. And setup time is pretty quick with Big Tuna, taking about 15 minutes. The reason why we're able to do high throughput is because it is a plate-based exchange solution. So you have two different options. You have an unfiltered 96, which has 96 wells, and an unfiltered 24, which has, you guessed it, 24 wells. There you can see the volume ranges for it. The 100 microliters are available in the 96 up to 450 microliters. And for the unfiltered 24, it picks up from that 450 microliter range and takes you all the way up to 8 mils. They both come in 10, 30, and 100 kilodalton regenerated cellulose molecular weight cutoff membranes. The 96 has an additional option of having a 3 kilodalton option as well. So switching from the consumable over to the instrument, this is what you see. If you're familiar with liquid handlers, this is essentially what Big Tuna is, but it's a very special one because of this buffer exchange chamber that's in the front. And that is where either your 96 or 24 unfiltered will go. There's nothing you have to change. It's just the software settings. So as we'll see in a moment, Big Tuna is compatible for both of them. And that critical piece, the ultrasonic volume check here, is indicated by 1. That's picked up by a gripper arm here, indicated by 5. The only other purpose for this gripper arm, as you can see the hotel rack, the tip hotel rack off to the right, is that gripper arm will move tip racks to and from the deck as well. Otherwise, there's really no other transport that happens. And you can see almost all of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, I can still count 8 buffer reservoir locations on the deck available for you. And those buffer reservoirs can be anywhere from a 1 well reservoir, deep well reservoir, as you see here, all the way up to a 96 deep well reservoir. And so that's what it looks like statically. Let's take a look at it in action. So here is that volume sensor. It's an ultrasonic volume sensor. Works for both the 96 and the 24 unfilter. As mentioned, the VPG or the gripper arm comes over and picks it up. Something that's not shown in this animation is that in addition to measuring the sample at the beginning and for every cycle, it also measures the position of the plate, because that plate position is super critical for getting an accurate read. So it's going to make sure that it's always in the correct position so you can get that within 10% volume measurement done with it. So here's now why you don't have to change anything out, whether you're working with an unfiltered 96 or an unfiltered 24. As you'll see in a moment, the 6-channel arm, which is liquid displaced air pipetting technology, very accurate, very nice CVs across a wide range. You can see that it has variable Y span, or that the channels can spread their distance, their raster distance, to work with either an unfiltered 24, as this animation shows, or the unfiltered 96. So besides being a plate-based solution, what else makes Big Tuna high throughput? Well, it's the fact that you can integrate so much of it. And that doesn't mean that you have to. This is definitely optional. But if you're a lab that has automation, Big Tuna might be the right fit for you. Whether it's upstream or downstream automation, Big Tuna can plug right into that. And you can, some of the things that enable that is the fact that, as mentioned, you can import and your buffer and sample lists right into it. You can also export the data out. So take it right from a LIMS or put it right back into a LIMS. We also have an API or a software piece that lets it be programmatically controlled externally. And then finally, the unfilters are automation friendly, meaning that a robotic arm can place them in the buffer exchange chamber and then retrieve them from it. So now let's switch to the little guy, Unagi. Here, instead of 96, we only have 8 exchanges that we can do in parallel. Slightly, a little bit different volume range, the same volume range actually on the unfiltered 24 almost. So it's from 0.5 mil up to 48 mils, but also very easy to use and set up. So on the Una, which is the single vessel consumable for Unagi, we have a 10, 30, and 100 kilodalton regenerated cellulose membrane. Those Unas go into the Una sample rack here, and then that is transported, and similar concept as Big Tuna. Here is the buffer exchange chamber. The Unas sit right in there. You don't have to run 8 at a time. If you have less than 8, you can use the caps here on the right to plug any holes. Instead of plate-based reservoirs, we use 50 mil conical tubes that are on the left here. Single channel, there's less samples, and a single channel seems to be sufficient. And here, the ultrasonic volume sensor is attached directly to the arm. So let's take a look at that volume measurement. Going to be very similar to Big Tuna, but again, in this case, the volume sensor comes straight off of the arm. And here you do see in the video the confirmation that the consumable is in the correct location before measuring the sample volume. And then also that single channel pipette, also very nice. This is just true air displaced pipetting. There's no pumps or anything involved with this, but we still get very nice, less than 5% CVs across the whole range of volumes and different viscosities that we would pipette. So there's the 2 platforms, Unagi and Big Tuna. That's cool, but what really matters are the results that you get from them. So let's take a quick moment to do that. So with Unagi, you have really premium recovery. And so here, well, using proteins, you see the example of the different applications you can run, buffer exchange with the option to concentrate, or if you just want to do that reduced sample volume, that large sort of volume concentration assay, you can do that. Here you can see that across all of these, we have very high recovery, around 96%. And this was greater than the 96% target exchange that we went for. So what kind of studies can you be doing with Big Tuna? Well, formulation studies, definitely, the ability to, look at many different conditions, in this case, different pH ranges for a single monoclonal antibody. We were able to set this up very quickly, have the run done in less than 8 hours with a 33% removal and a 96% target buffer exchange. And the nice part is that, you're freeing up your day, but you're not having to sacrifice sample quality. And so here you can see a 96% average exchange with all of the different MABs and the different conditions reaching their average final concentration. So here is an example of that reduced sample volume used with AAVs on Big Tuna. There we used the 30 kilodalton unfilter, and the results are very nice. And so we achieved 36-fold concentration, ran very quickly in about an hour and a half, and you can see that the capsid payload was kept intact. If you're working with DNA, as mentioned, you might need to desalt that. And so doing a buffer exchange as well as a concentration, here we have some example of both the unfiltered 96 and the unfiltered 24, depending upon, if you have larger or smaller volumes, and the results, the percent exchanges, as well as the final concentration values are very pretty much dead on to the targets that we wanted to achieve. And then finally, LNPs, the really hot vector right now. Here in this case, we wanted to exchange LNPs that were in ethanol into PBS and concentrate them. For that, they really love to have the larger molecular weight cutoff, so the 100 kilodalton. And here, within 90 minutes, we were able to process these LNPs. We don't show the data here for the size change, but minimal size change. More importantly, though, that percent encapsulation was kept at 96.5%. And so pretty much no change in encapsulation. And really, that's what it comes down to. on both platforms, since they use that same buffer exchange technology, you're going to get the same high quality results. And so it largely just comes down to, the sample number, the sample volume that you might be working in. And for Big Tuna, if you are an automation lab and you want to plug this solution into it, then Big Tuna is probably a better fit for you there. But both of them are very tasty solutions for your buffer exchange and concentration needs. So with that, I'll hand it back off to Sandra to see if we have any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Del, for telling us about buffer exchange with Big Tuna and Unagi and how they help to solve top challenges for buffer exchange of common biologics, antibodies and proteins, but also gene therapy biomolecules like AAVs, lipid nanoparticles, and nucleic acids. You have also showed us the benefits of biomolecule automated buffer exchange and concentrations to save time for downstream analysis. We have some great questions that have already been submitted. Again, for our attendees, you can still ask a question by entering it in the Q&A section of your Zoom navigation bar. So let's move to our questions now. So, someone asked, do you have temperature control on your systems? Can I put them in a cold room?
Unfortunately, no to both, but, and the reason why is because the equipment isn't tested, I guess, under those conditions, to run under cold conditions. And the good news, though, is that when most customers find out how fast that runs take, Sandra, on Big Tuna and Unagi, they realize that they don't necessarily need to keep them cold. And because of the way that the technology works, really, the fact that we are pushing, liquid through a semi-permeable membrane, a lot of what determines how fast it's going to take is the viscosity of your solutions. And so viscosity, of course, can go up with, colder temperatures. And so runs would really just take longer. So what we found is that most labs, when they realize like how fast their monoclonal antibodies, their mRNA, their LNPs can actually be processed, that not running it under a cold condition is acceptable.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question here. Does Big Tuna know when the wells are clogged, and what do you do when eventually they clog?
Yeah, so it does, because that sample volume measurement that happens, and this is true for Unagi as well, is it will measure the volume between every cycle, right? And so if there's a clogged well, there will be no change, I guess, between cycle of that volume. Now you have freedom to set the error handling for both of those, what you want to have happen. So it can either be automated or you can set it to what we call manual, so it'll alert you. Under both conditions, though, you don't have to worry about your other samples, because it's not or that clogged well as well, because it's not going to continue to add new buffer to it. So yes, we do know when wells are clogged, or at least when they stop flowing, I would say, and the system will respond by alerting the user.
Okay, sounds good. And another question that we have here, a lot of questions about Big Tuna. Does Big Tuna allow exchange with different sample concentrations in the same run, I assume? Yeah.
Yes, but they should be within, I like to say, the same neighborhood of concentrations. Again, the other thing that affects viscosity of your solution is your sample concentration. So something that's, at 0.1 mg per mil compared to 100 mg per mil protein prep, for instance, they're going to be, very different viscosities. And so you wouldn't want to run those. You could run them both on the Big Tuna, because as we just talked about, Big Tuna constantly monitoring, same with Unagi, your flow rates of each sample. It will, keep the faster flowing one from drying out, but the run's going to take a really long time. And so what we say is that you can bucket or categorize within concentration ranges, and those are in the software, but essentially it's like less than 0.5 mg per mil, and then from there up to, I would say, about 10 mg per mil. And so You can run them with different sample concentrations, but they shouldn't be large deviations, I would say.
Okay, that's clear. Yeah, thank you. Are your consumables endotoxin free?
Sometimes. So I guess the official answer should be no. We don't treat these consumables for endotoxin. We do have a pretty, I guess, easy to follow treatment, depyrogenation treatment that you can apply to the unfilters and to the UNAs to remove endotoxin. We've done testing, I would say, with our consumables. And actually, we had to introduce endotoxins to them for one of the studies we wanted to do because they weren't there. But there may be batch to batch variability under different manufacturing conditions. So we don't test them for being free from endotoxins. They may be, but if that's critical for your workflows, it's a pretty simple depyrogenation. Adds maybe like an extra hour to your prep to make sure that they're completely free of endotoxin.
Okay, thank you. What about, can you remove like buffer components that may interfere with downstream applications like iodexanol for AAVs or ethanol for lipid nanoparticles?
Yes, good question. That's something that we've tested many times, both just for internal validation and obviously for customers. A lot of customers use Big Tuna and Unagi for preparing both of those, Sandra. And those are the top things that we hear: ethanol for LNPs and then iodexanol for AAVs. Yes, we can remove it down. We don't have a specification saying like, oh, it'll remove every single time, it'll remove it down to X value. But in looking at the sample workup results that we've had for different customers and for internal studies, we get definitely ethanol down to like less than 0.1%, and iodexanol, I've seen ranges between like 0.02 to like 0.1%. And again, it depends upon that sample and kind of the settings that it's run. But we can definitely remove both of those substances.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question here.
Right.
And the question here is about, do the two platforms run with all kinds of tips, or do we need special tips?
Good question. So you don't need special tips. You do need to use the tips that we recommend, and they are different tips. You can source them from us, or we can let you know if you might perhaps already have them in your lab. But yes, so you do need to use the tips we specify. You don't need to procure them from us, though.
Okay, thank you very much. We're about to close here. For the unanswered questions, we will follow up with you. If you left your coordinates in there, we will contact you later. So Del, thank you very much for covering all these great questions, and thank you again for a fantastic presentation. I also want to thank you all who joined us live today. If you would like to have a deeper conversation with our team, please do get in touch with us at info@unchainedlabs.com or learn more on our website at www.unchainedlabs.com. We would love to connect with you. Thank you again for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.